Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to StoryForge Academy. It's great to see you here again. Settling in, notebooks ready, minds switched on. Today is session 4, and we're stepping into one of the most crucial parts of storytelling craft, characterization and the arc of change. In this lesson, you're going to learn how to define a strong protagonist and a compelling antagonist, how to think of characters not as labels, but as forces in conflict, what the 3 main character arcs are, positive, negative, and flat, static, and how Rubin's journey, in the poisoning at the hotel and Balochistan sequence, shows a man being pushed from passive accomplice to unwilling hero under extreme pressure. By the end of this session, you'll not only understand these concepts, you'll be able to summarize a full character arc in 5 clear sentences, and start applying this method to your own stories, novels, or screenplays. Before we dive in, a small request. If you're learning from these classes and want to support the Academy, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next sessions. Your support really helps us keep building deep, high-quality storytelling lessons for you. All right, let's begin session 4, Characterization and the Arc of Change. All right, let's begin. Session 4, Characterization and the Arc of Change, Poisoning at the Hotel, an Ambush in the Border Town. We checked into a modest hotel in the border town. This was our last stop before the illegal border crossing in the darkness of the night. The next day, the border smugglers were supposed to take us into Pakistan. That evening, we had dinner at the hotel's small restaurant. Dr. White and Victor, weary from the journey, ordered simple meals and seemed eager to rest to prepare themselves for the encounter with the mummy. I also tried to maintain my composure, but the anxiety of the upcoming trip gnawed at me relentlessly. But that very night in the hotel room, something terrible happened. Dr. Alison White and Victor were poisoned. This was orchestrated by the Pakistani intermediaries who were cooperating with the smugglers and the mummies. Discoverers, they knew very well that the presence of a mummy specialist would ruin their plan to sell a fake mummy. Furthermore, they didn't want any other witnesses present with me who could later recall the details. The poisoning was done subtly, through water or a drink sent to their room. It was a slow-acting temporary substance that caused severe nausea, dizziness, extreme weakness, and a complete inability to move or focus, but it wasn't lethal. The goal was simply to incapacitate them and remove them from the mission at the most critical moment. The next morning, I anxiously went to Dr. White and Victor's room. Both were severely ill, pale, and unable to move. It was clear they couldn't even take a few steps, let alone cross the border. This incident left me alone and in an emergency situation. Rubin's unwilling new role. Rubin continued. I immediately called Roland and explained the situation. Roland was shocked for a moment after hearing about the poisoning, but he quickly started thinking of a solution. He couldn't afford to lose that €25 million deal. He told me, all right, Rubin, the plans have changed. We can't risk waiting to send a new expert now. You'll have to go in their place. I asked in horror, me? But I have no expertise in mummies. How can I authenticate it? Roland, in a firm tone that left no room for argument, replied, you don't need to authenticate it. The intermediaries don't want anyone too involved. You just need to be present in front of them. You need to be next to the mummy and see that the sample collection takes place. The photos taken of the mummy and the sample we send must be sent to the experts in Germany so they can give their final opinion based on the images and the sample. Your presence is alive. Trusted witness is enough for them to be sure such a mummy exists, and it's not a scam. You did this for me, and now you have to see it through to the end. Rubin shook his head, his gaze somber. And that's how, for that diamond, I found myself in an unimaginable bind. Alone, in a hostile and illegal environment with a heavy responsibility on my shoulders, heading towards something I knew nothing about, and with no one else there to verify it. Night in Balochistan, Rubin's narration to Maria. Rubin took a deep breath, as if he could still smell the dust and feel the exhaustion of those nights. After that poisoning incident at the hotel, which took out Dr. White and Victor, I knew there was no turning back. Roland had given the final word. Now you have to go in their place. My only option was to brace myself for the horrors ahead. The mysterious path, from village to border. That afternoon, around 5 o'clock, a lean, local-looking man, whose face suggested deep roots in these regions, and who was the trafficker's main contact, approached me. His face was hidden in the dim light of a lantern. Without a word, he handed me a piece of paper. It read in English, "Just come with me and ask no questions, for I can give no answers." The pungent smell of sweat and dust clung to his clothes. He had an old motorcycle, and I got on behind him. Its exhaust let out a grating wail with each acceleration, and our journey began. We drove for about half an hour into the desert, until we reached a small village, with only 5 or 6 mud brick buildings, lost in the middle of nowhere. I checked my phone there and saw no internet signal. I truly felt cut off from the world. The guide led me to a cool, simple house. They asked me to put on Baloch local clothes and wait. A few minutes later, they brought me a simple meal: a fried egg with fresh local bread, cold buttermilk, and some local yogurt. I used gestures to ask the man accompanying me when we would leave. I pointed to my wristwatch to make myself understood, and he pointed to the sun. A clear sign that we had to wait until complete darkness. I spent the entire afternoon there, from sunset until deep into the night. Each hour felt longer than the last. The waiting was agonizing. Time felt suspended. The village's silence was broken, only by the distant sound of the wind or, occasionally, the bleating of a domestic animal. I was truly bored and decided to sleep, to think of nothing, hoping sleep would offer an escape from this uncertainty. Finally, absolute darkness fell. They brought me dinner again. This time, a delicious omelet with tomatoes and local bread. Its simple taste was surprisingly good in those circumstances. It was around 10 p.m. when complete darkness enveloped everything, and only the sound of crickets could be heard. Our journey resumed. We traveled 2 hours on the rough road by motorcycle. Each jolt shook my bones, and the smell of dust and gasoline filled my nostrils. We stopped at a point, and the man gestured for me to wait. All along the way, I carefully observed my surroundings, trying to mentally draw a map of the route. Perhaps for the day I might find my way back. About half an hour passed. Suddenly I heard 2 voices in the distance. The sounds grew closer, and we quickly hid behind dry bushes. They were Iranian border guards. Their flashlight beams swept through the darkness. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I felt it might burst from my chest at any moment. Their whispers passed by us, and a few minutes later, silence reigned again. The man accompanying me put his hand on my shoulder and pressed, saying, "Move. Quickly!" I followed him for a few minutes until he stopped. And so did I. It was around 1 a.m. We had apparently crossed the border and were now on Pakistani soil. The depths of Balochistan. Journey to Karan. Several men emerged from the darkness. Their faces were indistinct in the faint moonlight, but I could see their weapons. After a few brief words, the Iranian escort handed me over to them and immediately returned. I felt as if I had been abandoned among wolves. The new journey began. About 3 hours of strenuous walking over rough terrain and desert sand. Sand and grit infiltrated my shoes with every step. The damp, ancient smell of the rocks mingled with the dry desert air. We finally reached another village, a slightly larger one this time. There, they put me in a 4-door Toyota pickup truck, and the journey continued. For about half an hour the road was unpaved. Then we reached a paved road and picked up speed. 3 more hours passed, and then 2 vehicles turned onto a dirt side road, and we drove for about an hour deeper into the desert until, at dawn, we finally arrived at an ancient, abandoned caravanserai. The entrance to the caravanserai was dark and mysterious, guarded by 2 men in local Pakistani dress, armed with Kalashnikovs. I knew from the start that there would be no internet here. The only means of communication was a satellite phone. We entered the caravanserai. The smell of old dust and ancient stones filled the air, and several men came to greet me. I hadn't seen their faces before, but I realized they were Roland's intermediaries. They explained in a dry tone, "Since there's no internet here, the moment you enter the Sardab basement and see the mummy, and while you take samples, it must all be filmed in your presence. Then we'll go to another location where you can communicate with Roland via the internet." I said we were supposed to have a direct video call so the specialists could see the mummy. They replied, "Currently, it's not possible to move the mummy, and this is the only option." I spoke to Roland via the satellite phone, and he firmly told me, "Do whatever they say, and just come back safe and sound." Moments of terror. Waiting in the cellar. Rubin's story to Maria. Rubin took a deep breath, his eyes half closed, staring into the distance as if still reliving those breathless moments. In that hellish cellar, time had no meaning. There was only silence and the scent of decay and fear. Perhaps an hour had passed when I heard the low murmurs of the local contact speaking with the Khan from outside the room. Their voices faded in and out, but their tone had changed. There was no longer that initial subservience or humility. A chilling certainty settled in my gut. The deal was done. The money had been transferred. From Roland to the intermediary, and from the intermediary to the Khan. And with that dirty money hitting their accounts, we, the witnesses, had now reached our expiration date. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird, wild and relentless. I felt there was no time left for us to live. Breathing became difficult. The cellar air seemed heavier than ever. The Khan suddenly made a subtle gesture to one of his men, a quick, ruthless signal. Then he himself stepped back a little, as if to distance himself from the unfolding spectacle. In that very instant, the air exploded with the deafening roar of automatic gunfire. It wasn't just a shot. It was a relentless, brutal hail of bullets that shook me to my core. My eyes were fixed on the spot where, just seconds before, the local contact had been standing. He, the one who had dragged us this far, fell to the ground with a horrifying lurch. His body convulsed a few times, as if his wires had been cut, and his last breath escaped his throat with a muffled groan. His blood spread across the ancient stone floor of the cellar, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, the smell of death. A few minutes later, as the echoes of the shots subsided slightly, the chilling, ominous sound of shovels and picks began to cut through the silence. Thump, thump, scrape, scrape. Exactly the sound I'd heard in my worst nightmares. They were digging the earth. For what? For whom? It seemed they were digging a mass grave for those 3 men. For a moment my entire body trembled, not from the cold, but from a profound terror. Why didn't they kill me? The question screamed in my mind like molten lead. Why was I still alive? An insidious dread began to sprout in my thoughts. Maybe my time hasn't come yet. Perhaps I am the next mummy. The idea that they might keep me alive, like that dried mummy, for some sinister purpose was nauseating. Why wait? What terrible plan did they have for me? I was roughly shoved into a small, dark, windowless room nearby. My hands were still bound with rough, coarse rope. The air there was stifling and heavy, thick with dust and the metallic tang of fear. With immense effort, I struggled to my feet. In the corner of the room, there was a narrow, dusty slit. Perhaps for ventilation or a sliver of light. I dragged myself towards it and peered out through that tiny opening. The sight that met my eyes turned my nightmare into reality. A large, freshly dug pit in the hard ground outside the cellar. The 3 lifeless bodies, disrespectfully, were dragged across the dusty earth and then unceremoniously tossed into the gaping maw of the pit. Then, shovels quickly went to work, covering them with layers of dirt, as if they wanted to erase them from the face of the earth and from memory. In that moment, my heart ached not for myself, but for the families of those 3 murdered men. Would they wait forever for their loved ones? Would they ever know that their bodies lay buried in this nameless desert? I was lost in these agonizing thoughts when suddenly, a woman's piercing screams ripped through the deadly silence of the desert. It was a sound of pure terror, guttural and desperate, that made my hair stand on end. My body froze. Then, amidst the more familiar shouts of men, I heard it again. A cry for help, unmistakable, in German. No, I silently shrieked in my mind, banging my head against the rough stone wall. No, this isn't real. It can't be. My eyes were glued to the scene outside the tiny window. From a different part of the ruins, she was being dragged. She struggled, her body limp one moment, fighting with all her might the next. They pulled her, kicking and screaming, until she abruptly disappeared into a room right next to mine, her cries suddenly muffled. It was Dr. Alison White, the archaeologist. The brilliant, composed woman who specialized in the silent dead was now a screaming, living captive herself. My mind reeled. The terror was no longer abstract. It had a face, and that face was hers. Why was she here? How had she, after being poisoned, ended up in this living nightmare? Trapped in the labyrinth. Waiting in the caravanserai. Rubin's story to Maria. Rubin's gaze remained fixed on some unseen horror, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. In that hellish cellar, time had no meaning. There was only silence, and the scent of decay and fear. Perhaps an hour had passed when I heard the muffled whispers of the local contact speaking with the Khan from outside the room. Their voices cut in and out, but their tone had shifted. The initial subservience and humility were gone. A chilling certainty settled deep in my gut. The deal was done. The money had been transferred. From Roland to the intermediary, and from the intermediary to the Khan. And with that dirty money hitting their accounts, we, the witnesses, had now reached our expiration date. My heart hammered against my ribs like a frantic drum, wild and relentless. I felt there was no time left for us to live. Breathing became difficult. The air in the caravanserai room seemed heavier than ever. My wrists were numb with pain from the ropes, biting into my skin, as if blood no longer flowed through my veins. I was utterly helpless, truly at their mercy, trapped. There was nothing I could do. My mind, however, refused to be confined. I sat there dissecting every grim possibility. My thoughts raced, trying to piece together the horrifying puzzle of what was happening. My only connection to the outside world was the muffled sounds filtering through the thick walls. The oppressive silence of the caravanserai was occasionally broken by the scuttling of a beetle in a corner or the distant rustle of wind sighing through the ruins, but any other sound was acutely amplified. Then, the rhythmic thud-thud of shovels and picks began again, tearing through the suffocating silence. That ominous sound was the final blow to my inner peace. It was them, the Pakistani traffickers, digging once more. I managed to drag myself to the narrow, grimy slit that served as a window, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom. And there it was, right next to the fresh mass grave where they'd buried the 3 men. Another pit was being dug. A wave of pure, visceral terror washed over me, chilling me to the bone. Who was this grave for? My blood ran cold. Had I reached the end of my line? A horrifying realization dawned on me. I hadn't heard a single sound from Dr. White's room since they dragged her in. Had they killed her? No, it couldn't be. Why would they do such a thing? She was too valuable. But the silence, the longer it stretched, the more my fear grew. Time stretched, moments turned into hours, and I didn't know how much of my life was left. The dread of my own helplessness, my inability to rescue her, to even know if she was alive, pushed me to the brink of madness. I pictured her, terrified, alone, perhaps enduring unimaginable things. It was a torment worse than any physical pain. I slumped into a corner of my cold, dark room, huddling against the rough stone walls, my bound hands pressed against my chest. I waited, every fiber of my being taut with anticipation, listening to the relentless digging outside. About half an hour passed, and then, mercifully, the sounds ceased. The grave was ready, but for whom? The question hung heavy in the air. A silent executioner. Hours crawled by, each one stretching into an eternity. A deathly silence descended upon the entire compound. No sounds, no voices, just the pounding of my own heart in my ears. My mind was a chaotic storm. I felt time slipping away from me. I didn't know what to think. Anna and our unborn child? Would I die without ever seeing... Welcome back, class, to our advanced deep dive into narrative mechanics. The text before us, Poisoning at the Hotel, is more than just a thrilling segment of a larger story. It is a meticulously crafted lesson in narrative economy, the strategic use of sensory details, and the architectural construction of psychological dread. The requested expansion allows us to peel back these layers in greater detail, focusing on how the writer uses constraint and escalation to maximize the protagonist's and thus the reader's terror. The narrative economy of the inciting incident. Let us begin by revisiting the poisoning incident. From a technical writing standpoint, this event is a stroke of genius in narrative streamlining. The antagonist's motivation is simple and compelling. A specialist's presence would ruin their plan to sell a fake mummy. This instantly elevates the conflict from a simple smuggling operation to a sophisticated, deadly deception. The choice of poison, slow-acting, temporary, not lethal, is crucial. Had the characters been murdered here, the plot would have stalled, requiring a new team or a complex cover-up. By incapacitating them, the writer achieves two critical objectives. First, the credible removal of obstacles, Dr. White and Victor. Second, the immediate high-stakes replacement of the protagonist. This maintains a lean, focused plot trajectory, demonstrating superb narrative economy. The subsequent exchange with Roland solidifies the core theme. The ultimate conflict is between human morality and financial imperative. Roland's cold, firm tone. You don't need to authenticate it. You just need to be present, is the voice of the market, reducing Rubin's ethical dilemma to a simple logistical necessity. Rubin's horror is the reader's tether to morality, but Roland's voice is the absolute law of the world the author has created. This moment officially converts Rubin from a secondary accomplice into the unwilling, unqualified hero, magnifying his future helplessness, tenfold because the reader knows he is operating entirely outside his competence. The architecture of isolation and sensory immersion. The journey that follows is a masterclass in establishing a sense of geographic and psychological isolation. The writer systematically breaks down every connection Rubin has to the safe, known world, building an architectural structure of dread. The initial steps, leaving the modest hotel and following the lean, local-looking man, are marked by the deliberate deployment of sensory immersion. Notice how the environment is rendered hostile through specific, tactile details. The pungent smell of sweat and dust, the grating wail of the motorcycle's exhaust, and the feeling of being truly felt cut off from the world, due to the lack of a simple internet signal. This absence of connectivity is the modern equivalent of being hopelessly lost. It is a modern-day psychological constraint weaponized by the antagonists. The journey is structured as a series of ever-deepening plunges into the unknown. The village of waiting. Time is slowed to an agonizing crawl. The focus shifts to the small, mundane details, the simple meal, the watch pointing to the sun, which contrasts starkly with the extreme danger, a technique known as bathos that makes the subsequent terror more potent. the border crossing. This stage is all about auditory suspense. The sudden silence is broken by the two voices in the distance and the sweeping flashlight beams. The physical act of holding one's breath mirrors the reader's suspension of disbelief. The protagonist and the reader are unified in a moment of acute shared panic. The descent into Balochistan. The transition from the Iranian escort to the several men emerged from the darkness is abrupt and terrifying, cementing Rubin's total abandonment. I felt as if I had been abandoned among wolves. The 3 hours of strenuous walking and the specific mention of sand and grit infiltrated my shoes, and the damp, ancient smell of the rocks forces the reader to feel the protagonist's exhaustion and discomfort. This is not just travel. It is a form of subtle psychological and physical attrition. The destination, the ancient, abandoned caravanserai, is the perfect tableau for a final act of betrayal, isolated, remote, and steeped in a history of forgotten travelers. 3. The weaponization of sound and the climax of betrayal. Upon arrival at the caravanserai, the narrative shifts from atmospheric dread to explicit violence. The exchange between the Khan and the intermediary, marked by the loss of initial subservience or humility, signifies the climax of the business deal. The line, "the money had been transferred," is the true catalyst for the horror, confirming that the witness, Rubin, has reached his expiration date. The sequence of the execution is a profound lesson in the weaponization of sound in narrative. The deafening roar of automatic gunfire is shocking and sudden, confirming the violence. However, the subsequent sound is far more chilling. The chilling, ominous sound of shovels and picks. Thump, thump, scrape, scrape. The sound of the disposal is prolonged, rhythmic, and inescapable. It is the sound of existence being erased. This prolonged auditory horror, the creation of a mass grave, is more terrifying than the immediate gunshots because it is a definitive, unhurried act of erasure, confirming the perpetrator's complete control and lack of conscience. Rubin's internal conflict is framed by this sound. Why didn't they kill me? The question screamed in my mind. The writer introduces the horrifying concept of existential dread, the fear of becoming the next mummy, of being kept alive for a fate worse than a quick death. 30. The ultimate subversion, the return of Dr. White. The segment concludes with an absolutely masterful narrative twist and escalation. The writer subverts the reader's and Rubin's established reality by reintroducing a character who was supposedly neutralized, Dr. Alison White. The signal of her return is entirely auditory, amplifying the impact. A woman's piercing screams ripped through the deadly silence, followed by a cry for help, unmistakable, in German. The use of the German language is an instantaneous, visceral connection to Rubin's and Roland's world, violently inserting familiarity into the ultimate hostile environment. It is a brilliant form of delayed reveal, transforming the abstract terror into a concrete, personal trauma that includes a responsibility for rescue. The final horrifying image, the repeated digging of a second grave, right next to the first, establishes the final layer of psychological torture. The grave is not for the men. It is a silent waiting maw of earth. This visual and symbolic conclusion leaves the reader and Rubin suspended on the very precipice of death, trapped in the darkness, with a newly arrived victim and the chilling certainty that the end is near, yet completely unknown. The brilliance of this ending lies in the writer's refusal to provide closure, instead maximizing the unbearable tension of the waiting, an ultimate expression of psychological suspense. Hello everyone, and welcome to Session 4 of our Advanced Creative Writing Seminar. Today we are moving from the mechanics of tension and world building, which we thoroughly analyzed in the previous session, into the core of narrative movement, characterization, and the arc of change. Our goal today is to apply the concepts of the hero, the villain, and the three major character arcs, positive, negative, and flat constant, to the compelling excerpt we have been studying. The text provides us with a stunning, high-pressure laboratory for examining how character is forged and transformed by circumstance, defining the character roles, hero and villain. The first step in understanding any narrative is identifying the primary opposing forces. The protagonist, the unwilling hero, Rubin. Rubin is not a traditional heroic figure when the story begins. He is an accomplice, motivated by self-interest, the diamond, placing him initially in a morally gray area. Initial state, the flaw need. Rubin is a passive follower, driven by a material, external desire, the diamond, and obedience to Roland. His primary flaw is his lack of self-agency and moral commitment, prioritizing personal gain over safety or ethics. The hero's journey trigger. The poisoning of Dr. White and Victor forces him into the hero role. He is stripped of his expertise and security, making his mission intensely personal and perilous. The shift. His journey is not about gaining a skill. He never learns about mummies, but about acquiring moral conviction. By the end of the provided text, his focus shifts entirely from the diamond to survival, witness-bearing, and the rescue of Dr. White. This transformation, under duress, is the essence of a compelling protagonist arc. The antagonist, the corporate criminal villain. Roland and the Cons Group. In this narrative, the antagonist is multifaceted, representing both a distant, calculating threat and an immediate, visceral one. The mastermind, Roland. Roland is the corporate, cynical villain. His character arc is flat, constant. He does not change. His only motivation is the €25 million deal. He is the voice of pure, unfeeling pragmatism, utilizing human assets like tools. His villainy is detached, operating via satellite phone, making him omnipresent yet untouchable. The executioners, the Cons Group. These are the visceral villains. They represent the immediate physical threat. Their actions, the cold-blooded execution of their own men, the casual digging of the mass grave, and the brutal capture of Dr. White are governed by the Ibsen absolute law of the transaction. Once the money clears, witnesses are eliminated. Their change is minimal, demonstrating a flat, constant arc of pure functional brutality. 2. Analyzing the character arcs. The concept of the character arc defines the emotional and psychological journey a character takes. Positive arc, Rubin. Rubin's trajectory, clearly, defines a positive character arc. This arc occurs when a character overcomes a lie or flaw they believe about the world or themselves, moving from a negative state to a positive one. The lie flaw. Rubin believed the lie that self-interest and financial reward, the diamond, could justify his participation in a morally compromised scheme, and that he could remain a passive observer. The change. The poisoning and the subsequent terror in the caravanserai shatter this lie. His focus shifts from the diamond to the immediate. Selfless need to survive and protect another innocent person, Dr. White. The moment he hears the German scream and thinks, "My mind reeled," the terror was no longer abstract. It had a face, and that face was hers. He transcends his initial greed and embraces a heroic impulse. The final state, emerging. By the end of the text, Rubin is no longer Roland's pawn. He is a traumatized survivor whose primary motivation has become a moral one, escaping and exposing the evil he has witnessed. He has been forced to become the agent of change he initially lacked. Guide the flat arc, constant, Roland. The flat arc is often overlooked, but it is vital. The character does not change, but their steadfast commitment to their core belief, often the truth, but here, a defining lie, allows them to catalyze change in others. The core lie, for Roland, the lie is that everything, including Human life and ethical integrity is a negotiable asset whose value is purely financial. The role. Roland functions as the catalyst of terror and transformation. His unshakable commitment to the deal, the €25 million target, forces Rubin out of his comfort zone and into the arc of positive change. He is the unmoving obstacle against which the protagonist must define his moral strength. C. The negative arc, the fate of the intermediaries implied. While we do not follow a major character through a complete negative arc, where a character descends from a state of grace or moral neutrality to an irredeemable flaw, we see a symbolic example in the three murdered men. They were initially accomplices, operating for profit, but their actions ultimately lead to their violent, anonymous erasure. Their short, sharp journey demonstrates the ultimate negative consequence of choosing greed over morality, not a psychological descent, but a total physical destruction and narrative dismissal. In-class exercise, writing the arc of change. Now, let's put this theory into practice using our protagonist, Rubin. Your task is to concisely summarize Rubin's positive character arc from the start of the excerpt to the end of his narration, focusing on the shift in his motivation and identity. You must write the arc in exactly 5 declarative sentences. Here is an example, which you should use as a model for clarity and focus. Rubin's positive arc model. Rubin begins as an anxious accomplice whose main motivation is the reward of the diamond promised by his employer, Roland. The poisoning of Dr. White and Victor forces him into the mission alone, turning him from a spectator into an unwilling participant. Witnessing the cold-blooded execution and mass burial shatters his self-delusion, making his primary goal immediate survival and escape. Hearing Dr. White scream in German elevates his motive beyond self-preservation to a moral imperative to save her. By the end, Rubin is no longer defined by the diamond, but by his sheer, terrifying resolve to be a witness and a rescuer in a hostile environment. Take the next 10 minutes and compose your own 5-sentence summary of Rubin's defining change. Focus on the internal journey. We will discuss your results shortly. Welcome back, everyone. Please take your seats. I'm excited to dive into today's session, which I consider the absolute heart of compelling storytelling. Characterization and the Arc of Change. Session 4. Characterization and the Arc of Change. A story is only as good as the characters who live it. They are the emotional conduits for your audience. Today, we're not just sketching outlines. We're giving them souls. The dynamics, protagonist and antagonist. Every effective narrative requires a core conflict, and that conflict is best embodied by 2 opposing forces, the protagonist and the antagonist. The protagonist, hero. This is the character who drives the plot. They have a central goal and are the primary agents of action. Crucially, the protagonist often has a fundamental flaw or need that the journey will force them to confront. The audience should be able to identify with their struggle and root for their success. The antagonist, villain, opposing force. This character or force stands directly in the way of the protagonist achieving their goal. A truly great antagonist is not simply evil. They are driven by their own complex, often internally logical motivation. They should challenge the protagonist's strengths and exploit their weaknesses. When the antagonist is well developed, they can be as compelling, if not more so, than the hero. The conflict between them is personal, high stakes, and inevitable. The evolution, the character arc. A character arc is the transformation, or journey of an individual throughout the narrative. It's how they change, or perhaps fail to change, in response to the story's events. There are 3 primary types of arcs. The positive arc, transformation, growth. This is the most common and satisfying arc. The character begins with a lie they believe, a great flaw, or a fundamental misunderstanding of the world or themselves. Over the course of the story, through trials and suffering, they recognize this flaw, shed the lie, and transform into a better, more capable person. They are fundamentally different and improved by the end. Example: a cowardly character finds their courage. The negative arc, downfall, corruption. The opposite of the positive arc. The character begins with a good intention, or a strong position, but makes increasingly poor, selfish, or destructive choices in response to conflict. By the end, they are worse off, morally bankrupt, or completely defeated. This arc is often used in tragedies, cautionary tales, or to create a powerful antagonist who descends into true villainy. Example: an idealist becomes a tyrant. The flat static arc, the catalyst. In this arc, the central character does not change. They possess an already developed and strong sense of self, morality, or belief. Their function in the story is to remain steadfast and, through their unwavering nature, change the world and the people around them. They are the catalyst for everyone else's change. While the character remains static, their understanding or application of their core belief is tested and reaffirmed. Example: a wise mentor whose teachings inspire a protégé's change. Practice time, mapping the arc. To truly grasp the concept of the character arc, we need to distill it down to its essence. Remember, every character's journey is a mini-story in itself. Your task for the next 10 minutes is to choose one character. It can be from a known story, or one of your own invention, and write their entire arc of change in precisely 5 sentences. This exercise forces you to identify the core lie, the inciting incident, the transformation, and the final state. Example: positive arc. Sarah believed true happiness came only from material wealth. 1. The lie. When her small town was threatened, she was forced to work with the community she once scorned to save their shared livelihood. 2. The inciting event action. Through teamwork and sacrifice, she realized the value of connection and purpose. 3. The realization. She successfully led the effort and rebuilt her home, focusing on community well-being. 4. The climax action. Sarah ended the story as a selfless community leader who found profound joy in giving, not taking. 5. The resolution: new self.